people are saying. And well, the same thing was happening in the 90s, except it was all trade. It was all globalism coming on the scene, and people kept saying, well, you can't stop the train of globalism. It's inevitable. It's coming. You can't turn it back. And so the PNTR, they call it, Permanent Normal Trade Relations with Communist China, came up because up until then we've been doing a year-by-year analysis depending on the human rights situation. And then you all remember Tiananmen Square in 1989, where the students were calling for democratic reforms in the Communist Party, and they got essentially run out of the square with tanks and live fire. Anyway, by the year 2000, they were still reviewing it, and there was a lot of discussion about the fact that China was still very much top-down dictatorial human rights violator. Nevertheless, Republicans were in control, and they felt compelled that somehow we had to establish trade with Communist China. So the bill was drawn up by a representative from Texas, Bill Archer, Republican, and brought to the floor of the House. And the people in charge were David Dreyer, who was a Republican out of California, and Roy Blunt, Republican out of Missouri. And Roy was the deputy whip of the House Democrats. Well, it went up for a discussion and for vote, and people that were opposing it, interesting enough, were Dana Rohrabacher out of California, who was very outspoken on Compion Ramos situation, if you remember that, the border agents, and the other person was Ron Paul. Ron Paul made a statement that basically the greatest human rights violator is Communist China. Why would we want to do a trade agreement with them? That didn't stop anything. The vote went through, and the final outcome of the vote was 164 Republicans in favor, 73 Democrats in favor. 164 Republicans, 70% of the positive vote that passed free trade with Communist China was a Republican God and Country Party vote. And I really want to get that out there, because until we get into this kind of thing and start studying what really went on and what's really happening in our government, they can tell us anything. They can tell us they're going to bring jobs back. John Boehner's out there talking about bringing jobs back, and we're going to create this, we're going to create that. They can't create anything, because we're set up right now that anything novel that comes on the scene gets transferred to China and the technology that came along with it. That's how things are working now. That vote went down. Of course, Blunt voted for it, and so did Boehner. And so did Bond, and so did Danforth. And Bond and Danforth, Bond especially now, he votes for most of these trade agreements. But they voted for free trade with Communist China. We don't talk to Cuba. That's off limits communism. And Venezuela is even worse. Fox News is always telling you how bad Venezuela is. But somehow the communists in China are good enough that we can trade with. And the communists in China, to this day, are still persecuting Christians. They're still forcing abortions on people who have more than one child. And there's not definition, but there are substantiation yet, but there's a lot of word that they're harvesting body parts from prisoners, Tibetans, and Falun Gong people. And this Communist China is exactly the opposite polar end of ideology from the United States. We are the land of the free, home of the brave, home of individual rights. Our Constitution is all about individual rights. Government is our servant. We are the government. In Communist China, it's a one-party system, just the opposite. People have no rights, no freedom recognized. If they have freedom to choose their ketchup, but they had better not speak out against government. How did our Congress decide that we, the United States, should link up with Communist China to the extent now that it isn't 40% or 50% Communist Chinese in our stores, it's 90 or 95%. And we buy that material from them. And I don't know what your personal situations are as far as life goes. I'm 100% pro-life. Even in the case of rape and incest, that's our party position. And the reason for that is we believe strongly in the right to life, liberty, and happiness, and the Creator who gave us our rights. and our rights are so precious that no man can take them from us. So we believe strongly in the right to life. And if we believe that Creator created life, then how can we at some point say, but another life is mine to decide on, and that somehow the Creator in His ultimate wisdom must have made a mistake. We know He takes lives early. We know that children die, and 20 and 30-year-olds die, and we sort of accept it as that's the doing of, if you're a believer, that's the Lord. He's got His reasons. And we benefit many times from these early deaths because we can focus on their life in their most vigorous state. So then how do we get to the point of saying that this baby in the womb, somehow, because of the circumstances of his creation, he doesn't deserve life, or she doesn't deserve life? We wouldn't do that to a 2-year-old that was standing beside us. If that 2-year-old was the product of rape or incest, we wouldn't take his life. So we need to think that through, and that's a big concern. But getting back to these issues of these trade issues and what we stand for as Americans, when I grew up, we made everything. We were capable of doing anything we put our minds to. We were an inspired country. We put a man on the moon. The president said this is what we ought to do, and we got behind it, and we made it happen, even in the midst of the Vietnam War and all that difficulty. So today, we're just almost at the opposite end. We're kind of like wondering, do we even have a future as a country? What will our children inherit? And we know we're swamped with debt. And we have wars going on. You spoke of wars that are ill-defined and not directed by Congress. And I worry about these young men coming home, armless, legless, and maybe not even coming home at all. And I think about those young men that went to Vietnam, 58,000 on a wall in Washington. And we told them communism was bad. You've got to fight for your country. And we had a draft, and they went over there, young people, and many of them spent their last days staring up at the sky, wishing that they would have not come and maybe could go home again, but they didn't. So now we're at a situation where we're going to the store and we're seeing made in China. We're buying it without any thought about it. It's the old boiling pot thing. It's been pulled on us. The frog was put in the pot, and when it got water, or the water got warmer, we didn't notice. Well, they put the communist Chinese stuff in the stores, and there was more and more and more, and less made in America. Till the point we're at now where we just kind of go by it and don't think anything of it. We're just building up the next great superpower, which happens to be a communist country. And our leaders, worse, both parties, none of them look at that situation and say, we made a mistake. When it got to be 50, 60%, we should stop this and reassess because we're losing our industry. No, they stayed quiet, and they still ask for more free trade. As our country goes down, our manufacturing disappears, we fall into debt to communist China. And my question is, what do we celebrate on the 4th of July now? We do it just kind of automatically. It's Independence Day. Independence? What are we independent from? When we're dependent on China for everything we need in our lives now, just about. So I won't go much further than this. I just want to say that I'm running because I want to make some kind of a change in the direction of things. We can't continue to support Democrat, Republican, as if that's the only choices. My opponent, Ed Martin, has been endorsed by Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bond, Mr. Danforth, Mr. Ashcroft, and Mr. Boehner. Get the two, John Boehner. In fact, he had a Boehner barbecue. And Boehner has virtually voted on every problematic piece of legislation that I can see, all the way from NAFTA, World Trade Organization, PNTR China, the Glass-Steagall, the Patriot Act, the Real ID Act. Oh, and the last thing I want to say is Ron Paul had come up in the late 90s with a bill to get us out of the World Trade Organization. That bill was opposed by Boehner, Blunt, Emerson, Hulshoff, Talent, Pelosi, and Skelton. So Ron Paul has no friends among that group, but Ed Martin has a lot of friends. And if we think that he's going to go to Congress and be an advocate of the grassroots, ordinary guy, when he's linked up with the greatest power in the Republican Party, that is globalist, we should think again. I asked for your vote. I asked for consideration of Constitution Party candidates. We're all basically trying to say, wait, folks, we have a Constitution, we have a rule of law, we have something that's given us 200 years of freedom. We deserve your perusal and your vote. Thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions for Nick while he's here? I'm going to spend a little time. Yes, but
I've just been doing a little research on my own, and I read some different information on various sources. There's supposed to be a tax, and it's like 0.5% on purchases that they're talking about, a federal sales tax to generate more funds for the World Trade Organization. Well, no, cap and trade.
Value-added tax?
Yes, I think so. And I mean, is there I guess what I don't understand is why that's not more mainstream and more people aren't aware of it, and how we, once you're in office, is there a way to vocalize that so that people are aware of it, so that we can generate the emails that we go back and forth and say, call your congressman, call your senator. I mean, Congress passed cap and trade in June of '09, and it's lingered in the Senate. And my opinion is that it's lingered because they don't want to disrupt the midterm elections.
The House passed it, the Senate hasn't passed it, but the House has it.
Correct. So I didn't know if there's a way to really vocalize that. I mean,
a couple of things. What I'd like to say on that issue, first of all, is that when the votes come up and there's 2,000 pages in the bill that began with NAFTA, people deserve to know what's in the bill. And when the minority party says, we didn't have a chance to read the bill, so we're going to vote no, as I said before, they already know the outcome of the vote before they bring it to the floor. So when the Republican Party says we're not going to partake in that, we're voting no, they already know they have enough yes votes to pass it. And with the majority Democrats they have, that's what they do. My thinking is, instead of just saying we're going to vote no, they should say the American people deserve better than this. We're not going to play in this game because it's rigged until not only we get to see what's in the bill, until the American people get to see what's in this bill. We shouldn't be asking now, after it's passed, have you read the bill, do we know what's in it? We should know all of that before the bill even gets voted on. So if the Democrat side is not allowing time to read the bill, it's perfectly legitimate from my standpoint to say the other party should opt out and say, give us 3 or 4 or 5 days or whatever is reasonable to look this thing over before we have to vote on it, rather than just saying, well, we don't like not being able to know what we're voting on, so we're voting no, because it gets passed. And nobody knows what's in the bill. Back to your question about it's a long question.
sorry.
Cap and trade is really a subtle movement to launch world government, is what it really is. In fact, the Copenhagen Agreement that was supposed to take place in this past December was meant to be the start of global government. Ban Ki-moon, the UN secretary, basically made the announcement in the New York Times, an op-ed piece, the dawn of the beginning of global governance, he calls it. But and the head of the EU did so at the same time, saying at the same time. It didn't work in Copenhagen because the small countries found out that they weren't going to get the benefit of all this largesse coming from the carbon producers, but rather they were going to see austerity too, and that the money was really going to the IMF. And the IMF is to fund world government, and it's a bureaucratic world government. And again, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is just a branch of world government.